Okay, I think we're ready to start. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for being with us on this cold, rainy day. We appreciate it. My name is Erika de la Garza, and I'm the director of the Baker Institute's Latin America Initiative program. On behalf of the Baker Institute and the American Jewish Committee, we would like to welcome you to this morning's discussion on U.S. and regional perspectives on immigration. I would like to extend my thanks to Dina and Randy from the AJC for reaching out to us to co-sponsor this timely conference. We appreciate their hard work, as well as their staff and ours, for helping bring all of you together today. The Baker Institute, like the AJC, has been committed to studying immigration for many years. We actually, later this week, have a workshop in Costa Rica where we will bring together, along with our partner in Mexico, CIDE, we will bring together 25 to 30 immigration experts from Central America, Mexico, and the US to discuss regional migration policy. Immigration is a multinational phenomenon because of the way it's covered in the media in the United States, mostly focusing on partisan politics, would tend to think of it as a domestic issue. However, it is every bit as much a foreign policy issue than a domestic one. We need to look no further than last summer's surge of unaccompanied minors from Central America crossing the US-Mexico border. This involves 5 countries: the sending countries, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, known as the Northern Triangle, the transit country, Mexico, and the receiving country, the United States. The lesson: no single country can tackle the challenges of immigration alone. It is a collective problem demanding a coordinated response. And I hate to call it a problem because it doesn't have to be a problem, but it's a collective challenge, let's say. Last night we had the privilege of listening to the ambassadors of El Salvador and Guatemala, as well as Mexico's Director General for the Protection of Mexicans Abroad. This morning, we are honored to have with us a distinguished group of experts. They will build on yesterday's presentation and address the concept of co-responsibility in its foreign and domestic policy dimensions. I will now pass the floor on to Dr. Tony Payan, who's the director of the Baker Institute's Mexico Center and an expert on immigration and other border issues. Tony will present our first panelist. But before that, please join me in welcoming our guest.
Thank you, Erica. My name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Mexico Center here at the Baker Institute at Rice University. I welcome you to this event. Thank you for taking the time this early morning to be here. The Mexico Center in the Latin America Initiative here at the Baker Institute are very happy to collaborate with the American Jewish Committee to organize this conversation. At the Mexico Center, we have paid attention to this particular issue for a long time. In fact, 2.5 years ago, I was invited by Erika de la Garza, the coordinator for Latin America, the director of the Latin American Initiative here at the Baker Institute, to come and direct a project on immigration. That was almost 3 years ago that I visited the Baker Institute, and then this summer will be 3 years ago that I came here. And so we've been at this issue well before and then after I came to the Baker Institute. So this is an important issue to the Baker Institute and quite important to us. And we've been on it for quite a while on this conversation. Well, let me introduce the first panel. Its title is A Shared Responsibility, U.S. Foreign Policy and Immigration. And it is a pleasure to welcome to this panel first Roberta S. Jacobson, the Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Western Hemispheric Affairs of the U.S. Department of State. Roberta was previously the acting assistant secretary from July 2011 to March 2012. She served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs from December 2010 until July 2011, with responsibility for management, personnel, and regional political, economic, and security issues. In addition to this role, she was a senior coordinator for the citizen security initiatives in the Western Hemisphere. Starting in June 2007, Jacobson was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Canada, Mexico, and NAFTA issues in the Bureau of Western Hemispheric Affairs. She previously served as Director of the Office of Mexican Affairs. From 2000 to 2002, she was Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Lima, Peru. Between 1996 and 2000, Jacobson was Director of the Office of Policy Planning and Coordination in the Bureau of Western Hemispheric Affairs, covering issues such as civil-military relations, human rights, foreign assistance, and counter-narcotics throughout the hemisphere. She also served as coordinator for Cuban affairs at the Bureau, executive assistant to the Assistant Secretary in 1993-1994, and special assistant to the Assistant Secretary in 1989 to 1992. And I met Roberta quite a few years ago when I first got to El Paso as a young assistant professor at the University of Texas at El Paso, and I began to specialize on border issues, and Roberta was working on all those issues, and so we ran into each other on numerous occasions in conferences and places and talked about the U.S.-Mexico border quite a bit, at least 12 years, 13 years ago, and so we go back a ways, and I've always kind of admired her work, and I'm glad that she's now in charge of this particular issue, and it's a pleasure to welcome her to this place. Let me also take the opportunity to welcome Oscar Chacon. Oscar was here a year ago in January, late January, as part of our activities on immigration here by the Latin American Initiative and the Mexico Center. And we held a workshop with CIDE in a year ago, and upstairs. It was a kind of a private meeting, and in fact, as Erica mentioned, we will be going to Costa Rica this weekend, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, to continue this conversation with some of our partners in Central America. So Oscar has been very involved in this, and he's not new to the Baker Institute. He's been here before. Oscar is the Executive Director of the National Alliance for Latin American and Caribbean Communities. Until December 2006, he was the Director of Enlaces America, a project of the Chicago-based Heartland Alliance for Human Needs and Human Rights. For most of the 1990s, Chacon served as the Executive Director of Centro Presente, Inc. in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He served for many years as President of the Salvadoran American National Network, SAN. Chacon is frequently a lecturer at national and international conferences, as well as a media spokesperson on Latino immigrant issues in the United States. And last January 2014, when Oscar was here, we were debating over the potential opportunity for immigration reform, and the elections of 2014 were coming up. And I remember Oscar saying something very important, that the Latino community cannot, in the United States, bind itself to a political party. The Latino community needs to work with both political parties. It cannot be dragged into an alliance with one political party or the other, at the exclusion of having an open and an honest conversation with the other political party, because both of them have half of the key that it takes to open immigration reform in this country. And so he made a case for broadening the conversation with both Democrats but also Republicans. And I think that was a key point that Oscar made a year ago. And I think to this day it is true, and it is still being played out. So please help me welcome our guests. Each of them will speak for about 12 to 15 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A in which you can participate. You can just stand up on the sides or raise your hand, and I'll moderate the questions and call on you and our panelists to answer the questions. Roberta, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you, Oscar, for being here. Thanks to all of you for being here this morning on a cold and slightly rainy morning. Everyone's complaining about the cold, but it was in the teens when I left Washington, so I actually think it's pretty nice. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. I thanked Ambassador Deregian last night for all of the support that he's given to this initiative, to Erica and to Tony, and to the work that they're doing here. But I want to take a moment to particularly thank Dina Siegel-Van, who frankly was a friend and an ally before she was such a colleague in the work that we've done. And without whom so many of the initiatives that we've been working on together in the region really could not take place. And for me, these conversations that bring the Latino community, the Latin American community, and the Jewish community together are sort of going back to my roots, starting with my first work in the region, which was on the Argentine Jewish community. So for me, it feels a little bit like coming home. But I do want to thank Tony, whose work I've admired so much over the years, and coming back to Texas to work on these issues means a lot to me as well. Randy Charlinsky, who I got to speak to a little bit last night, it's a great pleasure to be here. Something that Erica said really rings true with me, and that is that when we talk about migration and immigration, it is too often referred to as a problem instead of a challenge. I travel a great deal with Vice President Biden. I think I've now made 13 trips with him. He occasionally jokes that I work for him, not John Kerry. Kerry doesn't think it's that funny, but he has a great story. I won't tell you all of it because the Vice President's stories can go on a little bit. But the punchline of the story is that he's explaining to others, non-Americans, what the secret of the United States is, how we manage to reinvent ourselves no matter what the crisis, no matter what the recession, no matter what the particular moment of turmoil and conflict may be in the United States. And obviously the ultimate punchline is we draw the best and the brightest, we draw renewal, we draw diversity from all over the world. And it is a joke, if you will, or a story, a parable, that really reinforces the notion of migration as not just a challenge, but as, in fact, the source of our strength. So I think that really is what we have to remember, even as we talk through and debate the very real challenges we face when talking about migration. I also am reminded of when I first started working on Mexico about 12 or 13 years ago. A colleague of mine in the Senate was very keen to hold hearings in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the issue of immigration, and immigration as a foreign policy issue and how it was affecting our policy in Latin America and the Caribbean. Something that we in the Western Hemisphere Bureau believed was very much an issue in our foreign policy. And he was rebuffed soundly by members of Congress and their staffs who said, number one, this is a jurisdictional issue. It's not yours. It's the Judiciary Committee's, because when and if we pass immigration reform, it will be to adjust or amend the INA, the Immigration and Naturalization Act. It will not be anything to do with foreign assistance or foreign affairs. And number two, you dare not make this a foreign policy issue because that will kill it for sure. This is a domestic issue. Do not make it a foreign policy issue. And frankly, in some respects, for the years since then, we've been a little bit cowed by that sort of warning. And I think that it's long past time for us to recognize that it is a foreign policy issue, and it is very important that we bring those two communities together and embrace it as such. If we needed any better example of that, it came last summer. And I'll get back to that in a second. But the other thing that we've really understood, I think, over the last couple of years, and I think Secretary Clinton, who I worked very closely with, referred to it and started the dialogue in this vein when she was talking about counter-narcotics policy in her first trip to Mexico on the airplane, making more news than she expected to make at the time when she talked about a shared responsibility. And that this problem, counter-narcotics, was one in which we very much had a shared responsibility. It was all of our problems, and we all had to do something about it. The same is true, obviously, when we talk about migration. Both sending and receiving countries have responsibility in this issue. When we talk about people who leave, we have to talk about what they're leaving and why they're leaving, and the fact that no one wants to leave. And when we talk about places they go, we have to talk about the responsibility of those countries as well. Nobody can do this alone. There is, by definition in this process, there are two countries at least involved, and usually more than that. So we have to create an integrated policy, just as we are creating integrated economic markets, integrated foreign policies, and partnerships, which really has been the watchword of the Obama administration from the beginning in this hemisphere, equal partnerships throughout the hemisphere that must pertain on migration issues as well. The other thing that I think is critical in this hemisphere, and I spend a lot of my time, as I tell people, kind of jumping up and down and waving my arms, is that geography does matter. Proximity does matter. These are our neighbors. These are our border countries. These are countries with whom we have profound demographic, familial, economic relations. When you point out to people, forgetting all of the sort of emotional and familial relations that we have with these countries, that over 40% of our exports go to this region, more than to many of the emerging countries that people talk about all the time combined, right? Brazil and the countries of this hemisphere make up more than our exports to China. It makes up more than our exports to India. We have a stake in this hemisphere that is our own domestic economic stake, not just our sort of emotional and familial stake. And so I think last summer when we saw the influx of unaccompanied children was a bit of a wake-up call for people who hadn't been paying attention to this, but for those of us who were, we recognized that this wasn't a sudden thing, even though the numbers obviously were startlingly large. It was, in fact, a result of a very deep and long-term trend that will take us, frankly, a long time to turn around, even while we know that the numbers have dropped off quite dramatically, and we're pleased with that. We also know that unless we do things that are much longer term and really go directly to the issue of foreign policy, we are on a fool's errand, and we will see a repeat of those migration patterns. But the unaccompanied children crisis, 67,000 unaccompanied children, and that does not even take into account spikes in what we are calling families, that is, an adult with children who came, and individual adults. Last year from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, really did prove to us that these were, in fact, foreign policy issues. What was one of the first things that the administration did? And I was on a trip with the vice president at the time. The administration called the vice president and said, while he was on a trip elsewhere in the hemisphere, please stop in Guatemala on your way home, convene a summit of the 3 countries in the Northern Triangle plus Mexico, and start to get a handle on this issue. So we knew from the start that in order to address this issue, we had to work with the countries of the region. That makes it quintessentially a foreign policy issue. The upside of the crisis, I would say, however, is that for me, there were so many things we learned and so many things I hoped we would bring to the attention of those who weren't paying attention, that I think as a good longtime bureaucrat, I thought about it and said, in this tragedy, we have to find opportunity. And so there were a couple of things I thought we could do with the tragedy itself. One, we could ensure that we got the resources we need after severely declining resources for a number of years to help turn things around and rebuild in these countries in ways that we had not done for years. I was wrong about that, and Congress found a way to actually reject emergency funding, even while we had 67,000 unaccompanied children in the United States, which I found startling. But we also learned other things from the crises, more long-lasting, and I think more important in some ways at enabling us to deliver the kind of responses we need to do, both within government and outside. One of the things we learned from the crisis was, where are the migrants coming from and why are they leaving? Ironically, the data that we got from this crisis, we probably could not have gotten in years of doing surveys through our aid programs and with governments. Because when people come across the border and were processed by CBP, they had to answer very simple questions on where they came from and why they left. And on the whole, people were answering quite honestly. And so what we found was that in El Salvador and Honduras, the vast majority of unaccompanied children were fleeing violence. And in Honduras, for example, the vast majority of those children were coming from the north coast and from San Pedro Sula. In Salvador, it was a little bit more dispersed, very large numbers from San Salvador, but we knew they were fleeing violence. In Guatemala, it was not always the case. They were from western and northern highlands, and they were often fleeing poverty and lack of opportunity. What this enables us to do is target programs much more effectively at combating. Ambassador Altschul mentioned this the other day, and I think that is critically important if we hope to overcome the problem. We also created cooperation that we had never had before. The ability to work with Mexico and the three countries in a much more coordinated way in confronting this crisis, and in a longer lasting way that we hope will outlive the particular crisis and be continued in the communities in the United States and communities in the home countries, I hope will be one of the most lasting legacies, if you will, of this terrible crisis. But I don't think that we have yet succeeded with Congress. And I think that's going to be one of our biggest challenges going forward, with either Congress, and I'll be very honest about that, the old Congress or the new Congress. And one of the things we did also over the last 2 years, and I'm proud of this and my officers who did this, is we looked at our Central America strategy, which has been almost exclusively focused on security. And you heard that I was the security coordinator for our initiatives, the Colombia, the end of Plan Colombia and transition into post-conflict, but the Merida Initiative, the Central America Regional Security Initiative, and the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. And we said in Central America in particular, but it's true in the Caribbean as well, we were too narrowly focused. We were focused too narrowly on security because, frankly, that's what Congress would fund. We have got to broaden that out and make it more comprehensive. Unless we focus on economic development and opportunities, on retraining and jobs for young people, and unless we focus on the institutions of government and providing better government services more efficiently, more transparently, the security stuff isn't going to matter because it isn't going to work. So it has to be a broader strategy of development. And I will tell you that as we go to Congress and we explain that strategy, we get lots of shaking heads. We don't do nation building. Don't tell me about that soft side stuff. All we want to do is fund cops. All we want to do is fund border programs. So we're going to need everybody's help, because if we don't actually attack the underlying factors of this migration, we are in fact doomed to repeat it, no matter how much goodwill and cooperation we have, I think. The final thing I would say, and then I'm going to sit down because I think there's a lot more to say, but we'll talk about it in Q&A, is that I am struck as we look around the world, and we've had some of these conversations over the last couple of days. I'm struck as we look around the world, and in the rhetoric that I hear from many of my colleagues who work in the Middle East and from our leaders who talk about problems of radical youth, disaffected youth, those who join jihad elsewhere in the world, at the similarity of the phenomenon. Different causes, but for sure, but the similarity of the phenomenon and the inability that we sometimes have to look at a phenomenon closer to home that is just as dangerous and just as corrosive, but not in the name of religion or terrorism, but in this case leading to criminality, gangs, or narcotics cartels. It is that hopelessness and that inability to be offered something more by the state, by the private sector, by society, that I think we're seeing in young people in some of these countries. And we have to, in fact, design the same kind of all-hands mobilized response that we sometimes now see in other areas of the world. And I think last summer was a wake-up call for us, and I hope that we will be able to mobilize that support long before we have to deal with children on our border. Thank you very much.
Buenos días, todos y todas. Good morning, everyone. It's indeed good to be back at the Baker Institute from a meeting last January. I remember that day that I arrived, there was snow in Houston, and it was big news. As someone who's lived in Chicago for the last nearly 15 years, it's a bit of an interesting thing to see kids and adults really surprised with a little bit of snow. Anyways, first of all, I want to thank the American Jewish Committee for the invitation to be able to share the thinking of the organization that I work for, the National Alliance of Latin American and Caribbean Communities. We were actually born about 10 years ago, and we were born with the very deliberate goal of trying to find ways of narrowing the gap, between what we tend to see as domestic only and what others tend to see as international only. We really believe that the world we live in, and the cliche goes around that we live now in a global village. We really do. It's unbelievable the level of correlation, coexistence, codependence that there is. And when you look at a region like the one engulfed by the Caribbean nations, Central American nations, Mexico, and the US, there is really no doubt that this codependence, this symbiotic relationship, it's very real. And I am definitely a witness, not only that in the areas of policy that deal with foreign policy, they don't want to have this become in any way an issue, meaning immigration or migration. But the same is true on the immigration advocacy community. They don't want to deal with this from the factors that actually cause people to want to leave. And both argue the same thing. It is too complicated, if we were to mix the two. But the longer that we delay actually recognizing reality as it is and not as one would wish it were, the longer we are going to continue to basically waste resources, but more sadly, waste people's lives, which is very real, especially in this region we are a part of. I actually came to the US about 34 years ago. I was born and raised in El Salvador. And when I left El Salvador, I left it a bit in a rush. I didn't plan ever, to come to the US. Definitely jobs were not at all a concern to me coming to the US. I came because of violence. El Salvador at the time was engulfed in a very bloody civil war that particularly targeted young males. I was indeed young once, and I was part of that demographic. And so I understand perfectly well, pretty much from my first day, coming to the US, about how important it is to look at what makes people feel that they have to leave, their own country. Whether it is violence, lack of economic opportunity, or simply, and especially lately, the desire to expand, your horizons, the desire to expand, your opportunities, because one is surprised to see that a lot of the people who have been coming to the U.S., and I mean mostly adults, over the last 10, 15 years, are not necessarily people who didn't have a job, back home. It's just that they didn't feel, that the job they were in Mexico or Central America was ever going to take them where they really wanted to go. And this is very intimately related to, again, the issue of the fact that we live in a village where the same TV shows, the same movies, the same magazines, as a matter of fact, that we read in the US are also being read, throughout the world nowadays. I want to use my time with you to actually share the perspective that we've been presenting on the question, particularly of the unaccompanied children, but really using the unaccompanied children issue to explain the larger issues or the longer trends that have already been in motion, for the past, I would argue, 2-3 decades. First of all, I think it is important to understand the nature of the challenge, that we are facing. In our view, the migratory relationship between the U.S. and Central American countries, Mexico, has been very strongly influenced by questions of violence and proximity, the degree of influence that the U.S. exercises in these countries. I think it is important to mention that wars, narco-trafficking, gangs are all issues that have been very important in why people have been moving over the last 3 decades, on top of the fact that we have had a long-standing problem with lack of economic opportunity. But the issue of violence or narco-trafficking wars are all issues that in many ways tie back, to the relationship that the U.S. has had, with some of these countries in Central America. For example, gangs. I told you that I left in the context of a very violent moment in the history of El Salvador, but gangs were not part of that violence equation. Violence really began to be a big problem in several of these countries only into the mid-1990s, as the United States had begun much earlier to deport, people who, yes, were born in Honduras or El Salvador or even Guatemala, got involved in gangs in the U.S., were deported to countries that had no way of dealing, with that particular challenge. And we are seeing the results many years later. We now see how powerful gangs have become, in these countries. I think it is important to just make it clear that the links between those countries in Central America, in Mexico, and us are simply unavoidable. And indeed, we do no service to nobody trying to ignore that those links do exist. I think it is also important to highlight something that the ambassador already said. What were the factors that trigger, the increase in the number of people from Central America, particularly children, to actually leave over the last several years? The ambassadors yesterday said essentially that economic opportunity, family reunification, it's a big concern. But look, we have to really be honest about that. If you take a look at what the UN has been saying for the past several years in terms of the rise in homicidal rates, in these countries, it is not surprising to see so many people leaving countries that are within the top 5 most violent places in the world. Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala are within the top 5 places to be in the world if you are following, murder rates. Second, I think it is important to acknowledge that this violence absolutely gets to be taken advantage of by smuggling rings, that are all about making money, and they're going to use everything and anything that they can possibly get their hands onto to basically make more money. So if you combine, the violence, the desire of these gang or criminal organizations to take advantage of these issues, and then indeed you acknowledge that there are questions, of family reunification that are important to take into account, the result is pretty much what we saw. Not just over the last year or through the summer of last year, but frankly over the last 3-4 years. I mean, the numbers of people coming into the US from Central America began to increase significantly beginning in 2009. I mean, and they just kept steadily growing, and they exponentially grew last year. But all these issues combined, explain, why that particular situation took place last year. And I don't want to take too much time speaking about that because there has been a lot said about the issue. I only want to emphasize one question. Many of these kids and families, are really running away from violence. And our means to protect them in the US, or frankly, through countries in transit like Mexico, are still not yet, where they should be. And frankly, politics play a big role into this. I remember, that when this crisis began to happen, everybody were already thinking about midterm elections and how the issue of the kids was going to impact the political equation, when it comes to outcomes in the midterm election. And I believe that that has a lot to do with how we decided to deal, with the crisis, fully knowing that this indeed was a humanitarian crisis. Now, what I really want to focus on is what are the more longer-term factors, that are behind this migration. First of all, and I briefly referenced it earlier, we come from countries, meaning Central American nations, and frankly, a good part of Mexico would qualify, under what I'm about to say. We come from countries where the economic systems in place for decades, if not centuries, have only been good to produce inequality. And inequality in a way that we are only beginning to understand in the US because of our own problems of inequality lately. But back in Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador, it was not at all a secret throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s that most of the farmable land, in agricultural economies, were owned by, frankly, something along the lines of 1% of the population. And so that reality of lack of economic opportunity resulting from these very difficult realities of economic inequality are very much at the heart, of why people have kept coming. Second, there is a clear lack of opportunities, and not just opportunities, but robust opportunities, that ensure the well-being economically, socially, culturally, politically for the majority populations in these countries. And in my view, these are the two structural issues that need to be addressed if we are ever to really come to find a humanitarian, a common sense-driven balance, between how many people should be leaving from these countries or how many people should be staying, in these countries. And let's just make clear, most people want to stay in their countries. I am yet to meet a Mexican who wouldn't love to be back, in Mexico, had they had all the opportunities that they wish they had had, or a Salvadorian for that matter, or a Honduran. Look, from a weather perspective, it's a lot better place. From a food diversity perspective, a lot better too. So there are many reasons, why people, if given just a tiny bit of opportunity, they would absolutely prefer to stay. Now, I want to move to what to do before such a set of overwhelming challenges. I think that the immediate response that has been given by most governments, including ours here in the US, has been driven still, by a so-called national security consideration. We are yet to really take a real turn in a direction that emphasizes building opportunities, because economic development gets to be sometimes too diffuse in terms of what do we mean. But it boils down to really creating opportunities for people to feel realized in their own place of birth, be that El Salvador, Honduras, or Guatemala, or Mexico. We basically would like to submit to you, I would say, 3, 4 key areas where we feel a difference could be made if we were to focus not only on stemming, the immediate crisis, but really look at what can we do now to begin to set the stage so that the issue that we are dealing with in terms of increasing numbers of people wanting to leave these countries comes basically to an end, and it comes to an end in a nice way. First of all, we believe that it is absolutely crucial to go a lot further when it comes to educational policy and education systems in Central America. Literally, revolutionize or profoundly reform even more what we understand by public policy and what we do by educational system. One change that has occurred over the last 4 decades has to do with the reality of migration. And migration, whether we like it or not, implies breaking families apart. Why has so many kids in Central America in particular gone into gangs? Because the basic family structure support that there was once to support them hasn't really been there. And so to what degree can we put together an alternative set of institutions and practices that can in a way make up for the fact that these kids don't have anymore that kind of support? From our point of view, it really means tackling from head to toe what we understand by education policy and educational systems. Second of all, we believe it is absolutely crucial to take a hard crack at public health. There are still kids dying in many of these countries because of gastrointestinal complications. Healthcare has to become something accessible, functional for all of the population in those countries so that we can reinforce what can be accomplished through profound education reform. 3, we are talking about countries that are still enduring a huge gap in terms of basic infrastructural development. And I mean, to be very specific, fair, safe housing conditions for the majority of the population. If you ever travel to any of these countries, you will see how horribly hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people live. I mean, that cannot continue if we are to really switch the orientation of the dynamics so far. And 4, because I really believe, and my organization profoundly believe in the concept of co-responsibility, we believe that it is crucial that we also hold our own governments accountable when it comes to making sure that the resources to pay for what I'm talking about do not depend exclusively on whether there will be foreign aid. I mean, I would love, for the U.S. to become a much wiser nation in as far as investing in what I don't see as a waste or a handout, but essentially as an investment for our own well-being. If we are to really embrace this relationship, with Latin America, particularly Mexico and Central American and Caribbean nations. But the reality is, countries in Central America do generate wealth, but we are not being responsible enough to be able to pay for what needs to happen. And to be very specific, I think we need to also pause and reject ideologically driven solutions and instead embrace evidence-based research about what actually works. And when it comes to taxes, look, the tax revenues as a percentage of GDP in any of these countries are vastly insufficient if we are ever to pay for what needs to happen. Just to give you an example, the average Latin America-wide relationship between tax revenues and GDP is about 20.7. El Salvador, right now, 15.7. Guatemala, 12.3%. Honduras, 17.5%. What is the average relationship between tax revenues and GDP when it comes to the countries members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development? 34.6. If you go back to our own history in the US and you look at where were we back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s that allow us to build the kind of middle class that we came to have, our rates were pretty much there, pretty high. And again, I am the first to admit, to speak about these issues nowadays, especially in Chicago, is heresy. You know, because you're talking about increasing tax collection. And we've been taught that taxes are bad, you know, and the government should be small. Look, in countries like those we are dealing with, we have to embrace evidence-based research and come to grips with the fact that unless these measures are taken, this is just going to be basically a revolving door of problems, never to go away. I have more to say, but I run out of time, and I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar. And I think you're absolutely right. Just a couple comments on the remarks, and then we'll open it to questions. You're absolutely right. I think that what we're looking at is essentially the idea that we have to redefine the problem of immigration as an intermestic, that is both domestic within the United States as a national problem, but also an international problem. And I hope that this conversation keeps moving that debate, because then we begin to see that what we require is international cooperation and solutions by all countries to come together and figure out what exactly is pushing people out and pulling people in. The issue of evidence-based research is going to be very important. I recently was in the state of Chihuahua. I'm a native of the state of Chihuahua. And when I go to Mexico, I like to talk to a lot of people and try to figure out what's going on, what people are thinking. And even in a state like Chihuahua, in a country as wealthy as Mexico, there are conditions of poverty that are simply unacceptable. In talking to a friend of mine who's a medical doctor in a general hospital, he was describing the conditions in which people who are brought down from the mountains of Chihuahua, the Sierra Madre, to the city for medical attention are. And the most harrowing description was about the children that are brought from the mountains malnourished at the point of death. And when I asked him what was going on, he said, well, you know, we are pushed by the authorities in the state not to write on the death certificate that the children died of hunger or malnutrition, malnourishment. They put in false information on the death certificate. What that points to me, and how that fits in this conversation, is that we need to take responsibility for this, not only in the United States, but that these countries also have to take responsibility for being honest about what is it that is pushing people out. It is simply unacceptable, and I've been to El Salvador now and Guatemala and in Mexico, and I can tell you that some of the conditions in which people live in are simply unacceptable. And it's not the United States' fault, per se. There are factors in the United States that pull people, and we have to look at the pull factors, and we'll be watching what happens now that the U.S. economy recovers and there are new incentives for people to flow back into the industries that hire undocumented workers, construction, prepared food industries and such. But we also have to take a look at the conditions on the ground and link them back to development. But I think those countries also have to take responsibility for the conditions on the ground. When I visit the Sierra Madre in Chihuahua, it is really a terrible situation, and the authorities themselves do not often acknowledge that they have a problem and then try to hide it out. So to me, this is clearly an issue that points to the fact that we need to gather data and evidence, and we need to do analysis, and then we need to target programs. And again, I want to emphasize something that was said. We need to put aside our ideologies. We need to put aside all these emotions that immigration brings to the table, and we need to try to figure out exactly what is happening to people on the ground that is both pushing them out and pulling them in, and then address those issues with clear evidence and concrete programs. And that's the great challenge. We can no longer think of this as something that Congress has to resolve. We have to resolve it ourselves as well. And we hope that we can here build a new attitude towards immigration, an attitude that says, look, this is a shared responsibility. This is something that we all contribute to, and all are responsible to do something about. And I hope that that's the one message that I think that we can take away from thinking about this issue as a foreign policy issue, where everybody takes a piece of that responsibility pie and then eventually digests and takes in the lessons that each of us has to take away, and then the action, and takes the action that each of us has to take. And thank you. Yeah.
Would you mind if I made just a couple
Sure.
comments about things that Oscar said that I thought were really thought-provoking? And I won't take up more time because I know there are questions. Just a couple things. Oscar talked a little bit about protecting people in country. And this was one of the most important things that I think did come out of last summer. And it is critical because you do have to make sure that people can be protected at home if they're fleeing violence, as well as giving people refuge in the United States if they qualify for it. So one of the little-known programs that we were able to get up and running, and I don't know how well it's going to satisfy because there are conditions in it that are not going to allow as many people to qualify as we might like, was the beginning in record time of an in-country refugee processing program in the 3 northern tier countries. On December 1st, we went live with applications for in-country refugee processing in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And it's the first time we've done anything like that in Central America. This is usually something that we do frankly, in war situations. We will also have the possibility for parole into the United States. And obviously, it will be months before we see what kind of response we've got via applications and what kind of acceptance rate we have. It is also true that for those under 18, they have to have a legal parent in the United States. But I would note that the President's executive actions on immigration have changed the status of some of those parents to allow them to have their children come in. But in any case, I think that was one very important change that we made, at least to try some creative ways. We're also looking with UNICEF and UNHCR and others about what can be done in terms of movements of people within countries to places that may be safer. Second, I don't think, one of the things that was really striking to me, we've talked a little bit about it today, and I think it was very striking yesterday that the ambassadors acknowledged this quite openly in terms of the tax issue and the importance of getting the business class, the upper class and the business class on board, because we all know the story of Colombia, and that Colombia was really able to begin to turn things around when President Uribe convinced his business class to pay their fair share. In that case, it was deemed a war tax, but they were finally convinced that they had to be part of the solution with the government. That has not happened yet in Central America. And to those people who say, we're not going to pay more taxes and pay more into government coffers because the government doesn't function and they don't provide adequate security and we're just going to contract it out and do our security privately, that is a self-fulfilling prophecy and an endless cycle. You defund the government, and of course it then can't provide you services. And it's endless, and that's exactly what we've seen in Central America. And the fact that the highest levels of violence and people fleeing is in San Pedro Sula, the commercial center of Honduras, where business does very well, thank you, behind its walls and private security, I think ought to be a disgrace. Those two communities, those under threat, side by side with the business community, there have to be ways that we can work better together with the private sector to overcome that. And I think the private sector is doing more in places like San Pedro Sula, but it has to be institutionalized, not just kind of one-by-one philanthropic programs. And then finally, I would say, one of the other things that's really important is the countries of Central America individually will never become Mexico or Colombia. Right? They won't attract the kind of investment and long-term economic stability to really overcome some of these problems. They can only do it through integration. And it's incredibly hard to give up, your electric company or your whatever the industry might be and create regional institutions. And I'm not talking about regional governance. Each one will be a sovereign national country. But they have to integrate more economically, and we've seen entrenched interests that do not want to work across borders. Well, frankly, smugglers and other criminal actors work across borders all the time.
Very effectively.
Yeah, they're a lot more agile than the legal side of things or the business side of things. And so we really need to be talking about integration, because 7 countries at 43 million people might be able to make a go of a bigger sort of economic power. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
I cannot resist to just comment quickly on the in-country processing. I mean, I think it was a great idea motivated by the right concern, and yet, it's problematic on several counts. First, there are only 4,000 visas, for the Western Hemisphere under this particular program.
My parole was added, though. Parole has no
limits.
Has no caps.
Correct. The problem is the way in which communities can actually access these benefits. It's not yet fully clear, and it's complicated because remember what I said about the smugglers and the people who are just loving to take advantage money-wise any opportunity they can. I assure you that there are already people offering access to these very programs for a fee, in the countries.
But we know that worldwide, and we find ways to avoid fraud.
I'm not holding the U.S. government responsible. I'm just saying what the actual practical implication is. Roberto and I agreed that we were not going to debate. We were going to be very complementary to one another.
What we try to do, but you're
I
right.
agree.
You're
I agree.
Right.
And on the question of taxes, actually, if you go back and look at the tax policy laws in Central America in the 60s and 70s, they were actually pretty good laws, by and large. The problem is nobody followed them.
Right. That's exactly right.
There was no accountability as far as law enforcement.
Right.
But the reality is we've gone from what used to be, at least in paper, a pretty good tax policy to essentially embrace the concept of sales tax, or as it is known, IVA, value-added tax, as the preferred way of taxing, which we all know. I mean, it is not the most fair, way of taxing, and that's a problem. And the last comment I just wanted to also make, what I was proposing that we need to really consider, particularly for the 3 Northern Triangle countries, it is not utopia. We actually have examples, even within the Central America region. Why is it that it's so hard to find Costa Ricans in the U.S.? Because they don't care about living. They're happy being Costa Ricans. They love their country. I've spent some time in Costa Rica talking to people cleverly, trying to figure out whether there is any hint, that they may be thinking about migration. Zero. And why? Because what they began to do, going back in the 1940s, or even earlier. And I think that that's something important that, again, is not utopia. It's very similar to the other countries. And on the question of public safety, public security, again, if you remove ideological lenses from the equation, we have a lot to learn from Nicaragua. They just don't have the problems that we have in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala.
In the communities.
Indeed. Their community policing practice is just very different than we have in any of the other countries.
Okay.
Great. Great conversation. Just raise your hand. I'll call on you. Yeah.
I was going to say, I think that one of the things that doesn't come out more, maybe Chacon touched upon it, is a lot of development we've had in Mexico and Central America actually itself causes out migration. Liberal economic policies. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have trade or anything, but this is an issue that's never brought up. So maybe you could expound on it.
Well, I mean, what we've said many times, and particularly when we were dealing with the advocacy work being done in favor of the Central America Dominican Republic trade agreement, we pointed out, look, you may find any explanation you want, but if you actually look at how many Mexicans left post-1994, to the U.S. versus prior, and how many people lost their way of life, namely agriculture in Mexico, following the coming into place of NAFTA, again, there are interesting correlationships in the numbers. And I would argue that the way trade has indeed manifested, in these countries, indeed, actually has led to more people wanting to leave. And on that, let me just also go even beyond the question of the trade agreement and how it has actually worked in Central American countries. There is an irony that we also need to be aware of. The more a country becomes successful in terms of access to information, in terms of access to foreign trade, ironically, the more interest it will generate in the native population to leave. I mean, that's just a fact. Now, the only way to counter that is if you can balance that tendency with a very strong national development policy that is not just about economics, but that it is also about culture, it is also about belonging politically, in the country, namely make democracy really meaningful. All that counters, the tendency. Otherwise, all Costa Ricans would have wanted to leave, but they haven't. And it is because they've done a good job, in my opinion, balancing these different factors.
Yes, here.
Yes, my name is Thomas O'Connor with Global Speak Translations. This question, Mr. Jacobson, is to you. Although I would have enjoyed listening to the debate between both of you, it sounds very spirited. One of the things that this question may be a little bit out of the scope of this debate, maybe not. But looking at your background, I see that you're involved with some Cuban affairs in your past. Now, other than the economic opportunities that we see that's happening with the spotlight on Cuba, a lot of businesses now eager to look at the prospective opportunities, how to build business there. But on the human side, with the foreign domestic perspectives and immigration, what do you see as a moving forward situation in Cuba?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is, despite a huge amount of interest, sorry? Oh, you need to repeat the question. The question was on the human side, although there's been a lot of focus on the economic side of the change in policy towards Cuba and whether there are openings on the economic side. The question was on the human side, or on potentially on migration. Are there going to be changes? How do I see the future with Cuba? I think there has been a lot of focus on the economic side. Let me just say, because I would get in trouble if I don't. On the economic side, in fact, although the regulations will come out really soon, the embargo is still in place, and the economic changes may not be as large as people think they are in terms of doing business in Cuba. But on the human side, I think one of the things I want to really be clear about, because we've seen a lot of there have been a lot of misinterpretations, some of them willful by people since the announcement by the president on December 17th. There's always been controversy over the wet foot, dry foot policy, the Cuban Adjustment Act. I don't actually see that changing anytime soon. I don't actually think Congress will act to change the Cuban Adjustment Act anytime soon, which has given special status to Cubans who make it to the United States. But surely, over time, the idea is that the causes that gave rise to the Cuban Adjustment Act should change, right? I mean, the point of having a special status for Cubans who came to the United States was because they faced a special circumstance back in Cuba. The point of the policy of the United States is that we would hope, frankly, that Cuba would be less and less special, not in necessarily some of the challenges that it may face similar to those elsewhere in the hemisphere, either economically or otherwise, but the Cubans would have a greater possibility and an opportunity to decide their own futures, to have a greater stake in what they're deciding economically and politically. So that as Cuba were to have a stronger civil society, that Cuba were to move away from a one-party state, the reasons behind the Cuban Adjustment Act would fall away. You know, it's interesting because we did see a spike in migration from Cuba in the month of December. I have not seen the micro numbers to know whether that actually coincided with the president's announcement. Numbers have been up slightly in the last year or so. But I don't know what we're going to necessarily see in terms of migration trends. One of the things that is interesting, and I do think we've talked about this a little bit, is whether or not, if we succeed in one of the basic premises of the president's announcement, which is getting more information into Cubans, right? The notion that 90 miles off the United States, people still can't, you know, access the internet freely, watch TV from all over the world if they want to, is pretty remarkable. On the other hand, the implications of that for migration may be something that we will see as information comes into Cuba. But obviously, Cubans on the island, many of them, have family in the United States, get a lot of information from that family already. My first trip to Cuba was in 1995 when we could still travel outside of Havana as official Americans. And I was at the Che Monument in Santa Clara. There was a very old soldier who was guarding the monument. And we got to talking, and he thought we were Canadian, as almost every Cuban did when they first started talking to us. And we started talking, and he learned we were Americans, and we had a fantastic conversation. And the first thing he said to me is, I have cousins in New Jersey, because he learned I was from New Jersey. And sort of that's the way it goes with sort of so many Cubans you meet. And so it's hard for me to believe that it will make a huge difference in migration, but I do think this knowledge that information about the United States, about the broader world, can change migration patterns will be extremely interesting to see if we're successful in trying to open Cuba up for information, because this is the particular area that the Cuban government claimed they were willing to move forward on, right? Telecommunications is the area that the regulations will open up, and the Cuban government has said they will give greater access to the internet to Cuban citizens. So we'll see.
Over here. Yeah.
Thank you so much, the three of you. You have really made very interesting comments and thought-provoking. I'm talking about what you were saying about dealing with this issue from an international perspective and a foreign policy perspective. It seems to me that perhaps we have lost the final objective. What the migration phenomenon should look like in the region at the end of the day. Are we talking about stopping migration? Like everybody should stay in their countries because they're happier there and they, have their economic needs fulfilled and, the wealth is better distributed within our countries? Is that the final objective? I think we should be talking about human mobility in the 21st century. And I think we should start talking and putting on the table what our economists need in the future. I mean, I'm pretty sure that there is a need for bilingual nurses in Mexico, as well in the US, as well in Canada, or agricultural workers in 3 countries for different reasons, or engineers when we talk about energy and the new exchanges that are going to take place within the region. So shouldn't we be talking about human mobility in a broader sense in the region?
Absolutely, and I'm happy that you have brought the issue up. Sometimes when one is watching the clock and trying to speak within what you were told you had to speak, there are stuff you have to cut off. But let me just share with you, beginning in 2013, my organization began to notice the increasing numbers of people being apprehended by the US Border Patrol. And we figured that there was something happening. We didn't quite understand, so we organized tours, throughout Central America for the most part, Mexico as well, but primarily Central American countries. And the title of these tours were actually Myth and Realities about US immigration policy. Because what we had heard, just talking to people, is that people were more willing to leave because they had heard that there was a chance to actually get some sort of fix, in the US. All false. But when we traveled there, one of the questions that we were asked is, so are you here to tell people not to leave? And we said, no, we're not here to tell people not to leave. We are here to make sure that you know what you will face, when you travel, and that you know what life will be like in the US. But I am absolutely with you, Minister. I think it is absolutely important to realize that in a village where finances flow pretty much freely, in a village where goods flow pretty much freely, but people don't, there is a problem. And I think that that's what we need to really, in the long haul, embrace. The notion of a balanced human mobility international arrangement. And that's not only good for countries in Central America or Mexico, that is good for the US. As a matter of fact, Tony mentioned the fact that as the economy begins to recover and more jobs get to be created, especially in sectors in the US economy that rely on foreign labor, there will be a need for more people. But let me remind you, every single day, there are 10,000 baby boomers who reach the age of 65. Every single day. This will imply that over the next couple of decades, it is hard to imagine that we will function well in the US without a significant influx of people. And we all could wish that they all be Chinese or Indian. But the reality is they're more likely to be Mexican, Honduran, Guatemalan, and Salvadorian. And so I want to loop back to what I told you earlier. When I said we need to revolutionize education policies in Central America and in Mexico, I'm not just saying so for those countries there. I'm also saying that part of that revolutionizing education ought to include making English proficiency mandatory so that we can have a much closer capacity to relate to one another strictly from a language perspective. Right now we don't, and it's a shame. Why did I say that we should focus heavily on healthcare reform from a public policy point of view? Because there are about 2 million Central Americans who came at prime working age to the US, who when I talk to them, they tell me, oh, I don't want to retire here. I want to go back to my country. But you know what will keep them here? If they don't have good access to health care in their own countries. And that's a win-win from a US point of view. Imagine if the Social Security Administration, specifically Medicare, were to craft agreements with these countries so that these retirees get their medical care taken care of there, compensated at rates that are true there. It's a win-win, but it's not gonna happen unless we build these capacities and we do it from the perspective of global mobility.
So my perspective on that is that I agree completely with Oscar, and actually the issue of accreditation of healthcare and interchangeability on Medicaid and Social Security is something that, in fact, I can remember discussing with my Mexican counterparts 12 years ago. And it's only grown more urgent from their perspective with the number of American retirees. But one of the things that strikes me is, and it's increasingly striking me in this job, there are a lot of organizations and experts who do healthcare policy, education policy, and even sort of housing, et cetera. One of the things that strikes me that's common to all of them is public administration, is how to run efficient, accountable, transparent government structures, right? Whether it's delivering education better or delivering public housing or delivering healthcare. And what I see over and over and over again in the region is extremely weak public sector institutions that are weak on delivering those services as services, weak on resisting corruption or criminality or whatever the particular pressure of the day, right? It could be narcotics cartels, it could be, whatever. And equally unable to account for, particularly well, foreign assistance or international financial institutions funding. And so I sometimes think that that is what we ought to focus on, is the institutions of strengthening those institutions to deliver whatever the particular service is, and then bring in experts, not necessarily U.S. government, frankly, who could train in how to do healthcare or education. Frankly, education tends to be a political lightning rod in almost every country of the world when you're talking about K through 12, so I'm not sure we want to touch that. But that to me seems the biggest lack. And I have to say, I don't know from what I've seen that the U.S. government really does this very well yet. Institution building. We talk about it all over the world. That and rule of law as the absolute necessities. And I believe they are, increasingly. But I don't know that we've yet gotten it right. I think there are lots of really, really well-meaning programs. I think there are some that work. But to me, that is the most crucial thing, because you cannot keep asking donors. There's a lot of money going into some of these areas, but it's not necessarily being used as effectively as it can. So it's a combination to me of better institutions and political will, which is that ineffable quality that none of us can necessarily manufacture.
It's something that cannot be underestimated, and I'll tell you why, because in the case of Mexico, for example, when we look at who's leaving, increasingly the middle and upper class is leaving. So it's not just the poor that are migrating. And so it's important to understand why the middle and upper class Mexicans are simply picking up people in Monterrey, in Guadalajara, and central Mexico and getting out, because they don't have access to education services that they wish for their children, because they do not have the health care that they require, because they don't have the services, because they feel overburdened in their taxes, because the taxes are also, to sort of say that there is a 12% tax rate in Mexico, kind of hides the fact that the very wealthy tend to pay a lot less, and the poor cannot pay. And so the middle class is really paying a rate closer to 35%. And the very wealthy kind of hide their money, and the poor simply cannot pay. So the tax burden itself is distributed poorly. And so in Brazil, we have the same issue, that the middle class is demanding services that the government cannot provide, and they're overburdened. And so it's important that we then begin to understand who's leaving and why they leave. In Mexico, corruption also is pushing people out. The weakness of institutions, the inability of the government to provide basic public safety and security is also pushing the middle class and the upper class out. So we do definitely need to broaden the conversation to include all these different topics: security, education, healthcare, services provision, taxes, because all of these constitute push forces as well. I'm going to pick up two questions real quick. And I'll pick them up real quick. I know we'll run out of time. If you can keep it really short, and then we'll keep our answers really short.
No, that's fine.
We won't even
Here, and there was another hand here. All right, really, really short. I'll exercise them.
So I want to say there's a bit of it seems like there's a double standard. I'll keep my comments. Because people go retire in Central America, companies go to Central America for very low wages. et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of us know about that. But one thing that I haven't heard mentioned or talked about is the role of the environment in migration and how is that affecting Central America and the migratory patterns and what's to come. I was recently in Nicaragua and the rivers are dry. We know there's a drought in El Salvador and so on. So Roberta and Oscar, if you could both speak to that from your respective perspectives in terms of policy and then.
Thank you. And I'll pick up one real quick, and then we'll keep it to a minute, and we'll go.
Just real quick, I spent 16 years living in Central America, and I saw a really interesting phenomena in Nicaragua. And as you say, because I agree with you with the security of the country, it really improved basically because of the Sandinista mayors. They've done a good job in maintaining security. But the interesting phenomena I saw there is this reverse migration in Nicaragua to Costa Rica. There is 20% of the population of Costa Rica, more than 1 million Nicaraguans, have migrated south. So my question is, why did they go south rather than join their brothers Honduran Catrachos to the north and migrate? Because the border is fluid. There, you can drive across the Honduran El Salvador border in 5 minutes. Yeah. And my last job is the security officer for the Peace Corps for Latin America. It took me 3 hours to get from Nicaragua into Costa Rica. So what explains that phenomenon?
If we can keep it to a minute, because we're eating away at our break now.
I'm just going to answer the environment question by saying I think you're absolutely right. I think that if we look at what's going on in Central America and frankly the Caribbean, those are extremely vulnerable economies that are in fact disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change, which is why we're trying really hard to build that into all of the programs that we're doing. And I must tell you that we're not finding a very receptive response to Congress, from Congress to some of the things that we try and build into the programs. But I think it's a very real problem. And I can't answer your question.
I
definitely that one to Oscar.
I agree generally with the question on the environment. I mean, I just would add, I mean, that when I said basic infrastructure, I had in mind precisely, the question of environment, because in the end, natural disasters don't kill people. What kills people is the lack of adequate ways of sustaining, what a natural disaster can do. Environmental disasters will come even more frequently in Central America, and we're not prepared, we're not adapted, for it. And I agree, Congress doesn't have appetite for that. That brings the question to us. I think it is people like us who need to be more persuasive with our members of Congress about these issues. On the migratory question, Nicaraguans going to Costa Rica, Roberta began to mention something about Cubans, which is true for everybody. In the end, it's about what you know, it's about the family ties that you build, and what happened going back 25 years or so ago, Nicaraguans began to basically replenish the agricultural worker capacity in Costa Rica. As they did that, they began to develop families in Costa Rica. That is why they have been going primarily to Costa Rica and not where, frankly, from an economic advantage point of view, they should be going, which is even to other countries in Central America. But I should tell you, there are increasing number of Nicaraguans and Hondurans going to El Salvador. Why? Because they can make about $100 a month versus 60. And that's what's making them leave lately.
Two things. Two things very quickly. We have about a 10-minute break. Please keep it to 10 minutes so that we can begin our second and last panel. And please help me thank our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony.
Very interesting conversation.
Encantador, ¿verdad?
Realmente un placer.
Igual.